Sandra Lee knows better than almost anyone what it means to miss the body's warnings. Over years of medical practice, she has learned to spot the quietest signals the human body sends, and has seen what happens when help arrives too late, when no treatment can undo damage already done. Yet on a day that seemed perfectly normal, with cameras running and everything going according to plan, she stepped past that safe line. Not because she lacked knowledge, but because she did not act soon enough. She waited over 12 hours to go to the hospital, not 1 hour, not 6. What makes this story hard to accept is not how fast things went wrong, but how they began. There was no dramatic collapse, no loud alarm demanding an immediate stop. Instead, a series of tiny changes appeared, each subtle enough to be explained away, each easy to postpone addressing. During those long hours, while nothing on the outside looked truly urgent, inside her body a different process had already started, one that once set in motion could not be stopped. There would be no second warning, no chance to redo those hours. What made someone who understands a body so deeply hesitate when facing its most dangerous signs? And across those 12 hours, how much did she lose that could never be brought back? A person's hesitation when the body sends alarms does not always start in that moment. Often it forms much earlier, shaped by how one learns to see problems and how one gets used to enduring too much. Sandra Lee grew up in a home where medicine was not a casual choice. Her father was a dermatologist, her mother worked in healthcare, and much of her childhood involved things most kids never see. Medical textbooks, clinical images, stories about treatment. In that world, the human body held no mystery. It was something to watch, study, and fix. With enough calm, everything could be explained. Over time, that mindset became a reflex. Her father had not taken an easy road into dermatology. In his early years, he taught himself from an old book in a place where knowledge was hard to find and he had to figure everything out alone. From that start, he built his own clinic step by step, slowly but steadily, until it became the foundation of their family. Sandra grew up inside that world. There was no real phase of finding herself, no clear detours. The path was already laid out, defined, stable, convincing enough that it never needed questioning. Along with it came something else: discipline, the ability to handle pressure, the habit of continuing to work even when the body starts sending signals. Those traits were fine until they became automatic. Those automatic responses did not vanish when Sandra grew up. They followed her into her training years, where everything got harder and left even less room for mistakes. She studied at UCLA and continued down the medical path already shaped before her. No major hesitation, no big detours, at least not until the system for the first time did not open its doors the way she expected. After her 4th year, Sandra was not accepted into a dermatology residency. It was not a small failure. It was the first time the path that had always seemed certain suddenly stopped. Her father's field, the world she grew up in, the direction she had barely ever questioned, all of it suddenly out of reach. She briefly thought about changing direction. The thought did not last long, but it showed her something. For the first time, the road ahead was not as clear as it used to be. And then, instead of turning away, she came back. Sandra kept pursuing dermatology, finished her training, and eventually returned to the very clinic her father had built from those hard early years. On the surface, everything seemed to fall back into place, stable, logical, predictable. But that experience left a tiny trace. A sense that sometimes, even when you do everything right, the result may still not be what you expected. And when that happens, the familiar response is not to stop. It is to keep going. Sandra Lee did not become famous the usual way. No medical breakthrough, no big lawsuit, no produced talk show. What brought her to public attention were videos most people first thought they could not watch. Her early YouTube days left almost no mark. The videos were too technical, too dry, more like clinical records than entertainment. But then she started posting extraction procedures, blackhead removals, cyst drainages, lipoma treatments, things that made viewers uncomfortable yet impossible to look away from. The biggest change came from one specific video: the removal of a huge blackhead from an 85-year-old woman's face. Not a dramatic surgery, no loud tragedy. Just a short, real moment where something trapped under the skin for far too long finally came out. That video got over 75 million views, becoming her most watched clip and effectively creating the name Dr. Pimple Popper. People did not watch just out of curiosity. They watched for the odd sense of relief those videos created. Disturbing, addictive, powerful enough to make viewers watch again just to believe what they had seen. From there, everything grew fast. Billions of views, a loyal fan group calling themselves Popaholics, a multi-season TV show, a personal skincare line, and a workload that ran almost without stopping. But at that point, Sandra Lee's success also showed its true nature. Everything depended on steady hands, absolute control, and precision with almost no room for error. If just one link inside her body shifted, the whole structure could start to shake. But that evening did not end with a vague feeling. When she tried to eat, she noticed that swallowing no longer felt natural. Not that she could not swallow, but something had shifted. Hard to name, yet enough to get her attention. She could not sit still for long. A sense of restlessness slowly spread, not tied to any specific thought, as if her body was moving to its own rhythm. Then her legs. Sharp pains appeared, brief but clear, different from normal muscle pain. And after that, the strangest feeling of all. Small electric currents running through her, brief but coming back enough times that she could not dismiss them as random. She went to bed, but could not sleep. Not because her mind was racing, but because her body would not settle. Fragmented signals, one after another, made it impossible to relax the way she usually could. Even so, Sandra still did not see this as a serious problem. Each single sign could be explained, and when looked at separately, none seemed severe enough to need immediate action. She told herself it was just a worse than usual day, and that after some sleep, everything would likely go back to normal. Around the middle of the night, when she tried to get up and move, her body showed something more clearly. Movement no longer felt natural. It was not that she could not walk, but each step came slower by a beat, as if her body needed extra time to answer. A sensation hard to describe. Not pain, not complete numbness, but a small disconnection between thought and movement. Her balance was no longer exact. Steps in a familiar space suddenly felt shaky, though not enough to make her fall. Looking back, that was when the signs were already clear enough. But at the time, it was around 2 in the morning. Everyone in the house was asleep, and Sandra did not want to wake anyone over a feeling she still could not fully name. Part of her still believed she was just too tired, that her body was reacting to long-term pressure, that everything might fix itself. She went back to bed, and once more she chose to do nothing. When morning came, Sandra woke up with a feeling unlike any other morning. No longer the scattered signals from the night before, but a clearer change. Her body was no longer as balanced as it had been. As she stepped out of bed, she realized one side of her body no longer responded the same as the other. Not a complete loss of movement, but a very noticeable shift, a sense of weakness, as if one half of her body was no longer in sync with the rest. That was when she began to check a very basic reflex from her medical training, raising both arms forward. One of the simplest ways to find neurological problems. She held both arms in the same position, but after just a few seconds, she noticed her left arm could not hold. It did not drop right away, but slowly drifted downward. Very slight, very gradual, yet enough to show the difference. She tried to speak. No one was in the room, but she spoke out loud just to hear her own voice. And at that moment, she realized her speech was no longer as clear as usual. Not completely slurred, but with a delay and distortion she could not ignore. These were signs she had learned long ago. She knew what they meant. But even then, a thought still surfaced, familiar, almost automatic. What if she was imagining it all? What if this was just a twisted feeling after a sleepless night, after an overworked day? She still did not act right away. Sandra went downstairs to where her parents were. Not a panic move, but more like a final check, a way to confirm that what she felt was real. Her father is a doctor. Her mother works in healthcare. They had seen situations like this before. When Sandra described what she was experiencing, he did not take long to assess it. No hesitation, no attempt to find a softer explanation. He said just one simple thing. Go to the hospital immediately. Not wait and see, not monitor further, but right now. By the time Sandra stepped out of the house to go to the hospital, the final decision had been made. But time was no longer standing still to wait for her. The first signs had appeared the night before. Then came a whole night with clearer signals, followed by a morning with changes she could no longer deny. All of it happened over more than 12 hours. Meanwhile, with a stroke, the most critical period, the so-called golden window, is measured in minutes. The first hour is when treatment can completely change the outcome. After that, each passing minute means the chance gets smaller and the damage starts to become permanent. Sandra understood that. But by the time everything connected, by the time the decision was made, the most important part of that window had already passed. Not because she did not know, but because she waited. Sandra nearly completely stopped working. She took about a month and a half off. For the first time in years, her packed schedule was fully broken. No more filming sets, no more back-to-back workdays, replaced instead by a life pace that slowed down because it had to. The first weeks were not complicated, at least on the surface. Just basic exercises. Walking, keeping balance, gripping objects. But those simple things showed the change most clearly. Her left hand, the one she depended on in her work, was no longer as steady as before. Not a complete loss of function, but a small instability, enough to make her realize her body was no longer working the same way, and for Sandra that was a very specific fear. Recovery did not follow a straight line. After about 4 months, she was able to return and start working again, but that did not mean everything had stabilized. She was still recovering. Some days she felt almost normal, movement smoother, responses better. But with tiredness or stress, everything would shift again. The symptoms would come back more clearly, slightly slower, slightly weaker, slightly less exact. The improvement did not vanish, but it was not constant. Even her voice changed in a similar way. The difference was very small, to the point that others might not notice. But for her it was always there, especially when she was tired or under pressure. And then she went back to the set. Not because everything had fully returned to how it was before, but because she had reached a point where continuing was possible. Yet the feeling was no longer the same. That very place where everything had started now held a different kind of tension. She admitted to a very real kind of fear, almost like PTSD, when returning to work in that environment. Sandra continued, but not in the same way. No longer assuming her body would always keep up with work's pace. No longer pushing herself past limits, without question. For the first time, she had to watch herself the way she once watched her patients, paying attention to every small change, every sign she might have previously ignored. Because now one thing could no longer be denied. Her body had changed, and listening to it was no longer a choice that could be put off. In those early days after, Sandra was not only thinking about recovery. She began to ask herself a question she had never had to face before. Could she still do this job? Could her hands, the very thing she had relied on throughout her career, still be exact enough to continue? In reality, for months after the stroke, Sandra Lee returned to work. On the surface, everything seemed to fall back into its original place. The set, the patients, the familiar lights. But beneath that stability was a different rhythm, slower, more careful. And no longer assuming her body would always function as precisely as before. She still works, still directly takes part in procedures. But how she works has changed. Movements that once happened almost by reflex now need conscious focus. She watches her hands more closely, controls each motion more carefully, and no longer pushes her pace to its highest level as she once did. Not because she cannot, but because she no longer believes forcing her body to its limits is safe. Looking back at the whole journey, Sandra Lee's story does not end with a medical event. It goes further, touching something almost everyone has experienced yet rarely truly faced. She did not lack knowledge, nor experience, nor the ability to recognize what was happening. Every sign appeared exactly as medicine has long described. The issue was not a lack of understanding. It was, in the moment, when a person chooses to believe a more comfortable explanation. choosing to wait a little longer, choosing to ignore it one more time, choosing to believe it is not that serious yet. And those very small choices, when stretched long enough, become the line between still having a chance and having none left. Sandra Lee returned. She continued her work, continued her life, and learned to adapt to a body that was no longer fully the same. But what she carries forward is not just the experience of recovery, but a shift in perspective. She no longer waits for her body to make it clearer. She listens from the very first signs. Because there is one thing this story leaves behind, not as a warning, but as a simple truth. The body always speaks before things become serious. It is just that we are not always ready to listen. And the final question no longer belongs to Sandra Lee. It is for anyone listening to this story. When your body begins to send signals, very small, very subtle, but not normal, will you stop or will you wait one more time? If this story resonates with you, do not hesitate to leave a like, because that is the only way we know you are here and that you still care about people like Sandra Lee. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you will not miss stories about other legends you admire around the world.